ladies and gentlemen. I think we get the pleasure of being what's between you and a lovely, fresh, cold glass of champagne. So if that doesn't keep you awake, I don't know what else will. But this evening, I've got an amazing panel with me. And the first thing I'm going to do is actually ask each person, I know there's a bio in the book, but I've asked each person to please highlight something about themselves that probably you haven't read about and don't know about, that would actually be even more titillating than what we have in the book. So I'll let Hannah start off.
No pressure. As it says in the book, I work in the secondary market. I've been running sales of contemporary African art for about 12 years now. What it doesn't say in the book is that in that time, the entire landscape has changed from an international perspective, and I think that's what I might bring to this panel. So 10, 12 years ago, there were very few places that you could access contemporary art from the continent outside those domestic markets, and that's what really interests me, where we've come in the last 10 years, and obviously where we are now and where we can take it in the future. So,
great, thanks, Anna. So the only man in the house, in our house, Ayo, tell us.
I run a gallery focused on modern and contemporary African arts, but I grew up in Lagos, Nigeria, came here at the age of 25. I was trained as an accountant, and I worked as an accountant for years before I started up a gallery. It's a completely different world, the art world. I actually joined because I thought you guys threw better parties. I'm not quite sure that's true anymore.
Great, and Touria.
I've created the 154 in 2013 with the mission to give more visibility to artists from the African continent and the diaspora. And it came from the fact that I was traveling Africa, was very excited about what I was seeing around the continent, and as soon as I would come back to London or to the US where I worked, there was absolutely no trace of what I was seeing on the continent. I'm myself a daughter of an artist, and I couldn't understand how the work was so good, but had no international global presence. So 154 was born 7 years ago, and we've been able to grow to New York in 2015, and we launched our first edition in Marrakesh in 2018. So we're very excited to be on the continent as well. Thanks.
Great, thank you. And Enam?
So I'm a textile and performance artist, but I also founded the Black British Female Artists Collective in 2015. As a way to provide more visibility for Black British female artists. I felt there was a real disparity when it came to platforms for Black women artists in the UK. And much of our work is about trying to build sustainable careers for our artists, but also working to build representation in the institutional space and working with young people, and also opening up the conversation on a more global scale to work with female artists across different regions to kind of understand the different challenges they face as a way to start thinking about how we can kind of overcome those challenges.
Great, thank you. I'm hoping that you've probably now realized that we have a very diverse panel, people from different approaches in the same ecosystem. And I think the idea is to sort of create a healthy, friendly debate about some of the questions I'm going to throw at them. So I'm not expecting everyone to agree. Hopefully, you all have different experiences of this whole theme about investing in art. So the question I have, the first one, is really about, and Hannah touched on the fact that the landscape has changed in the last 10, 12 years. I think Touria has done her bit to make that landscape change, and I think Ayo is probably hopefully experiencing some benefit from that change in landscape, and Enam is going to make sure that that landscape is more inclusive. And that's, I think, what we're all looking at. However, the first question really is, what is the valuation potential of contemporary African art? This change in landscape, what has it done to actually move the needle? Hannah?
Shall I start?
Please.
It's almost an unanswerable question. The potential is just enormous, and it relies on so many different things. If we look at 10 years ago and the market for contemporary African art, and I'm excluding a small number of artists who have been in the mainstream for some time, it's really gone from zero, practically zero, to where it is today, which is not huge. I think the last market report I looked at, the secondary market worldwide, was for contemporary African art at auction was about $20 million US. As a percentage of the international contemporary art market, that's something like 0.1%. So a huge gulf between where the representation lies in the marketplace versus where the representation lies if you look at the continent of Africa, the size of the continent, the population. I think population-wise, Africa represents something like 18% of the world's population, and obviously the diaspora beyond that. So the potential is just enormous in my mind.
Touria, what's your take on that potential? Is that what's spurring you on?
Well, I think that, you know, I'm very optimistic. I think I've seen artists since we've started, you know, have their art value probably 70 to 80% more than what they started with, presented at the fair, so that's a very good sign. But at the same time, as Hannah said, you know, on the global market, this is really absolutely nothing. The last panel that I was part of with the person from Art Tactics, I think the number is that the total global sales at auction for African artists is less than the Romanian artists from Romania. So a continent versus a country, you know, it's just crazy when you see the potential. But besides, you know, it's not a very good number, but it is definitely one that, you know, give us a lot of hope of growth, knowing that we have just touched the top of the iceberg and that we are going in the obviously right direction. I feel like, you know, we all have a lot of investment to do at all our different levels, you know, in terms of the layers of the ecosystem, in terms of like growing this market and making sure it goes into maturation in a way where we know we have a sustainable, you know, collector base, but also market for those artists. But I do believe that, you know, just getting on the global stage, giving access to people to view those artists, to be able to buy those artists, you know, really to have changed the landscape.
I mean, Ayo, so you're in the trenches. I mean, you're sort of at the forefront of this whole valuation question. I'm the client, and you're trying to propose that I invest in a particular piece. How are you going to sell that to me? The valuation?
It's not as hard selling that to people, to be honest, because the first thing we have to take this back to is, whilst we're talking about investing in African arts, most people don't buy art as an investment. There's a very emotive buy. They buy it for a lot of other reasons. The other thing to stress is that when we talk about the growth potential, and it's completely across the board, we agree, it's a low base. But we always talk from an external positioning. It's not, most art in Africa is not traded at auction houses. They're traded regularly by small dealers, small artists that's selling directly to their collectors. So whilst I agree the base is low, we just don't have the numbers. There are artists in Africa, Tedesse Messin, for example, Ethiopian artist. I was at a show in Lagos where he sold 6 works for $60,000 each at his fine art. He's never, ever sold at auction. You know, Victor Butler, the Ghanaian artist as well, maybe 5 or 6 at auction. I've been, again, at a show where I've seen like $200,000 being traded. And you're not going to see these guys registering globally. These numbers are small, but it's happening. But mostly it's happening on the continent.
Exactly. So I was going to say, you saying that perhaps the view that maybe Hannah has is probably not quite the right view, because there's a lot more happening on the continent.
Oh, no, it's a right view, but it's a global view.
Yeah, I think we're coming from very different standpoints, and certainly even within my own career. So I've gone from one auction house to a much bigger auction house, and I was with Bonhams for 10 years, where we started the international sales for African art, and we were catering very much to an African audience. Most of our buyers were African. Most of them were on the continent or living, you know, outside the continent, but traveling to and for. When I moved to Sotheby's 3 years ago, that was a real game changer, I think, for the market, alongside other players who are doing interesting things. And I saw my audience change entirely. I went from having, I think, in my average auctions these days, I have 4 or 5 times more bidders than I did in my previous auctions. And they are from every continent on the planet. We typically have over 200 bidders. They're from over 30 different countries. And I will say that a lot of them are international. Of course, we're very interested in encouraging African collectors, and we know there are a lot of African collectors, and back to your point, there's a huge enthusiasm on the continent, especially in key marketplaces. But this is of international interest, and the buyers are of international quality as well. So it's about making sure that we're elevating, seeing representation on an international scale in the art world as well.
So Enam, how does that affect you as an artist, and possibly even the foundation that you're created?
I think for us, we're definitely seeing a change. So we attend 154 every year here in London, and just seeing the kind of amount of visitors growing and growing year on year just shows that definitely there is an interest, and that's really encouraging and really exciting to see. I think it's definitely a case of us really building a different mindset, I think, about the value of African art, a value of contemporary African art, and really building a community, within the Black community that are going to invest and are going to keep sustaining the art space, I think is probably the best way, but it's really encouraging.
Actually, this leads me to my next question. Thank you. This is really about what the challenges are. I think each of you probably face a different challenge in trying to move the needle in the contemporary African art market. So just starting from the point of view of a dealer, what sort of, give us an example?
I guess back to the valuation questions, taking it back to investing as well. You're trying to buy art and sell art. You're trying to see your value of the art retained. The West has a structure for this. You buy art, you hopefully the artist has longevity on his side, it's placed in the right museums, you go to the Tate, you go to MoMA, you see those artists at these places. The most challenging thing from an African artist standpoint is fitting into those global structures. We've never created an ecosystem on vast parts of the continent where we have museum shows, being advertised and sponsored by BP, and you could go in and see these artists. It's also a bit of a big ask to ask MoMA to show all our successful African artists in their spaces, just to validate them. And whilst that validation should be done by us. And so if we don't have the structures to validate, then we have to create our own models. And right now, that's, we have to do that. That's a big challenge for us.
Is 154 trying to fill that gap, do you think?
Well, we are trying, we're encouraging, but I mean, the reality is like we have probably 95% of international collectors, so it's not yet, African collecting, contemporary African art, at least in the 3 different destinations. I think some of the challenge, come from all different, logistic aspect to, being present at the right places with the right curators and having this possibility of even discussions. When you have, one of the obvious problem, I think, which is a really basic one, is visa issues for artists. I think that we don't talk about that, which is a major disadvantage for any artist living on the continent, when they cannot be present even when they receive a prize because they're not, issued the right visa. That's the same for the residency program, being able to go and practice their passion or their professional, I guess, career because they have a visa issue. I think those are basic challenges that will make a huge difference, I think also infrastructure on the continent, having the right art space. Doesn't need to be museums, we don't have to copy every model there is, as long as it's an amazing, space that people respect and, have a huge impact, could be very good. And I think that, we've seen, the impact of those 2 small, institutions like the Zeitz or Makal, and, their basically enthusiasm, going around the continent, because we suddenly have an institution that can collect this art. But I think, the collector base also is a challenge, creating a strong collector base on the continent, because maybe, we are all benefiting from a fantastic trend and beautiful moment, and we want this moment to continue, and it can only continue if there's a sustainable market.
And from an artist's point of view, what would you say are the challenges for yourself and other artists like you in evolving your practice, getting that validation and getting, past just being African artists but being global? What do you say about that?
I definitely think there needs to be more investment, especially in Africa. So my experience is mostly from a Ghanaian perspective, and I think for one, it's an issue that arts education only really happens once you hit university. So it's not provided in primary and secondary education, and I feel like that is a real miss, but it then goes back to this kind of value system about what art is and you know, in a lot of kind of African cultures, it's not really valued as, you know, a sustainable kind of career, so it's not something that they would encourage their young people to do. So I think there definitely needs to be much more kind of investment in that, and as everyone said, in the infrastructure as well. But I think that, you know, there are some really fantastic artists doing, you know, work to provide those spaces. So Ibrahim Mahama just opened the CCA in Tamale, which is fantastic. I know Yinka Shonibara was talking earlier this morning about the space that he's opening up in Nigeria. And then there's also Black Rock, which just opened in Senegal. Kehinde Wali just opened. So, and that's fantastic to see that other artists are giving back as well. And it's kind of those models that I think will really help, you know, sustain it.
Anna, any comment on that issue?
I kind of want to link what everyone's been saying together in that, yes, we do need to encourage and nurture a culture of collecting, which maybe we take for granted here in London or in New York or in Paris. And certainly the opportunities are there. But also to Enam's point, value your artists and value your art. You know, there's one thing that, yes, I own lots. You can go to ArtX in Lagos, which is a wonderful contemporary art fair, the only one in West Africa, but the price points are low and they're very accessible. And that's great if you want to start collecting. But there also has to be movement at the top end as well. You have to take, if you value your masters, you have to take them seriously. It's something Kehinde said at the opening of Black Rock. He said he wanted a residency that made the artists feel valued and it's a high-end, beautiful project to make the artists who come and spend time there feel like they are of value and creating work of value. And even if you take it back earlier than our contemporary artists, but the 20th century masters, if I take it back to Nigeria, we get a lot of comments from collectors saying, well, why is Njideka Akunyili, a young artist in her 30s, why are you selling her for 3 times more than our greatest artist, Gbewonyo? And I say, actually, you have to support that market. You know, we don't create the prices, it's the buyers that create the prices. So I guess part of it is that discussion about investment, you know, seeing that art on the continent not only is worthy of buying and collecting, but I was right, buy what you love. Don't always think about the investment in the first instance, but it can be a wonderful investment.
So who makes the market, Ayo? Who are the buyers?
The artist makes the market. Let's start with that one. Without any artist, there's no product. And without a product, there's no market. So, but then I know where you're going with that question. So who's going to drive up the numbers? The collectors, of course. But then if you're talking about African art, then it's going to be... let me put it this way. I'm sure there's collecting on the continent. I know that because I've been in London for 7 years. Margaret Street, not too far. And till now, I think I have 60% of my collectors living in Africa. That's where they live. That's where the money comes from. What needs to change, and you are completely right to that, is that when I sell them a piece, you know, there's just a point where they get to, where they start thinking, Ion, this is not a house, right? There's just no chance. And I always like to joke about when they put their hand on their face to say, And I could see the Patek Philippe they're wearing that costs multiples of what I'm trying to sell them. But then that's still a question of value. So what might need to change, and I think it has to be driven from nearly everybody. Look, we need the very top end to place more value in what they're buying. But the way they're going to do that is if we all generated the excitement that's going to make them want to be seen as the leaders. You know, the young drives the old. So you guys start collecting, then they're going to want to actually step up to the plate and say, no, I'm the big boy. And they're going to pay more for what you're buying. It's simple.
And Touria, what's your thought about that, the market?
Well, I'm glad to see there's an optimistic view about it, but it's true, like to say a little anecdote. I was at this dinner trying to pitch contemporary African art and the value of it to a lot of businessmen from Africa, and I was like, actually there was a sale, sorry Anna, but it was at Bonhams where Sherry Samba had just reached, you know, £60,000, and it was a really good sale. And I said to the person next to me, who was from actually Congo, you know, like, you should be very proud, he reached that. And he's like, I was like, actually, you should support, you know, because this is an artist from your country, there's another sale coming, you know, and you'll have And he's like, is he from Congo? And I was like, yes. He's like, well, I'm going to go bargain with him. Why will I pay $60,000, $60,000 for this? This is crazy. London people are crazy. I'm going to go back home and try to get one for less of half of the price, basically. And I was like saying, this is the kind of mentality as much as it was funny, I was like, it's something that we need to change. He should be the first one bidding, and trying to get the price of that artist, to the level that he deserves. He's a very established artist. 60,000 for, an artist who have like such a strong career. When you think about it, you have artists from New York leaving school and getting that money with their first exhibition. And this is a guy who has worked, his whole life and just reaching, for us it's a good price, but it's completely unreasonable, when you compare it to American artists or to very young European artists who are getting the same price. No, I feel like, every year we've seen this percentage of collectors coming from the continent, even if they're very small, and our collectors coming from the diaspora growing little by little, understanding the system, because it's also a system that is imposed on them. As you said, Ayo, a lot of the collectors in Africa have been supporting their own artists locally for years, having developed direct relationship with those artists, supporting them like pretty much their whole career. They really don't understand why they have to pay a percentage to a gallery coming to travel to a fair to buy, a piece of art 50% than what they could actually buy directly from the artist. And you understand, but it's they have to come to a fair or they have to come to a gallery to see also the work that all those parties are doing for that artist, to value the work, to make it, into collection in museums, to place them into different talks or, in front of different curators to provide future exhibition for them, So this is, I think, a collector being based in Africa might not see this whole ecosystem and layers that count for the career of an artist.
Thank you. And so Enam, from the artist's perspective, how do you see that market evolving? How do you see this long-term sustainability that's going to make it become a career that artists can actually stand up and say, I'm an artist and this is what I do for a living, and it will sustain me? What do you think?
I think it's a difficult one because ideally it would be a case where you would have the support both in terms of your local governments would be able to set up funds like, we have the Arts Council here, we're very lucky to be able to have that. That's not happening, in Africa because there just isn't the economy to do that. And so it is heavily reliant on collectors buying and investing and being able to help artists build a career and then having, artists, like I've mentioned before, then giving back. So it is a difficult one, and it just means that we have a lot of work to do to really build relationships, long-lasting relationships with collectors and a really wide collector base. But it's not impossible, Asia was an emerging market and they are blazing, so it's just a case that it takes time.
And so also, I was going to say, it's also a function of GDP. Let's not ignore that. Africa is by 18% of the world's population and growing, and the GDP is 3% of the world's population. GDP is 3% of the world's GDP. It's like a finance friend of mine said, it's a rounding error. And it's a problem that we have other issues to address primarily before we start looking at culture. Now, why I'm optimistic is because this could have been said for music, 15 years ago. But the young musicians are blazing the trail because they took their own problems and created their own models. Now, some of the most successful musicians in Africa, Wizkid and Davido's, you'd be shocked to see what their studio spaces look like in Lagos. It doesn't look anything like what you see here. But it doesn't mean that the music is not being produced, marketed, and channeled. They found a model.
So, from point of view of, again, this is a market, and Sotheby is obviously, this is a global market, and really African art should be, when you're selling it, is a global asset that you're selling. And what are you doing about sort of trying to push the needle a bit in terms of trying to get your international collectors more interested?
So it was, we're talking about Africa, but also emerging markets, and Sotheby's have always been the first to enter emerging markets with Latin American art, South Asian art, Middle Eastern art. And it's interesting working with my colleagues in those departments. The path that we're following are very, very similar, but just a decade or two later. And I think that the lesson to be learned from all of them is actually that those African collectors are the ones who should be dictating who are the important artists. not international collectors. But there is an international interest in it, partly because of investment, partly they see this as an emerging market and it's a great time to get involved, partly because there are so few artists from the continent who are represented in international collections and are thought of on an international standard. When I joined Sotheby's, there were African artists who were sold in other categories, such as obviously our international contemporary sales, photography sales, print sales, but they're almost exclusively artists who left the continent in their teens and really have grown up in a very Western model. So I'm thinking the top-selling artists from the continent are people like Wangechi Mutu, Marlene Dumas from South Africa, Julie Moretu from Ethiopia, but really they're all artists who have been working under a very Western model. And so there's a lot of hype about the African market at the moment and a lot of people talking about it, but really they know very little about the continent and about art from the continent. So it really does have to be driven by collectors on the continent and artists on the continent.
I'm going to beg to differ on that point, really, because again, you just said something very important there, that some of the artists of African origin whose prices, who can command a higher price, are actually in categories that are not African art categories at all. And perhaps just the labeling of just saying this is an African art sale might be something that's, bringing the ticket price down. I'm wondering, do you always need to have a sale that's purely, labeled African art when some of the artwork could be, put into different classifications, and then the international buyer is approaching it not because of the name of the artist, but because it's an amazing piece of art?
Yes, is my short answer. I come across that question all the time in the debate all the time, and yes, it would be wonderful if we didn't need an African art sale, but the fact of the matter was, before I joined, there were, like I say, very few African artists. I can think of about 5 or 6 artists from the continent who were in our international sales. The 3 I just mentioned, Adeyinka, who's here today, which is wonderful, William Kentridge, Elanat Sui. And Elanat Sui and William Kentridge are the only ones who maintain their practice full-time on the continent. Obviously, actually, some of the others are now kind of paying it forward, and I know Yinka's got an amazing project coming up, or development in Lagos. I know Wangechi is spending more and more time in Kenya, but that's not where they made a name for themselves. Since I joined Sotheby's, we've set over 60 different world records for African artists who had never been sold at Sotheby's before. So yes, I do think there is a need for a special platform. Again, going back to our other regional sales, and we do have a regional department for every region in the world. So it's not exclusive to Africa, and I would hate the thought that we're downgrading Africa, that this is a derogatory term. It's really not. There's always a difference between what's of local interest or domestic interest and international interest, and I would like to see more and more African artists in our international sales, and I work very closely with our contemporary department on that. But if you look at, say, the Latin American market, our Latin American department opened in 1987, and it was only last year that they decided to stop contemporary Latin American sales and include all contemporary Latin artists in our international sales. So that took 30 years of building that market until those artists were really considered mainstream and of international interest, and there was no longer a need for a specialist category.
Well, thank you. And I asked that question because I think it's a debate that might be on everyone's mind, at least on some people's mind. And actually, just again, going back to the issue about, collectors on the continent should be in the forefront of supporting the artists. And I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the Chinese artists, for example, when their prices went exponential, because the Chinese collectors were the ones buying. And maybe you want to say something about that as an example.
I'm not an expert on the Chinese market or Chinese art, but yes, that's my understanding of the bubble that burst when it came to Chinese art was that international speculators went into that market, pushed up prices of artists that were not of interest to the Chinese buyers, and that's where some were kind of disposed and thrown to the side, and that obviously is the risk of some of these huge prices that you get at auction. We haven't seen that yet with the African market, and like I say, we're still at the very, very nascent stages. There is still so much to be done with this market before you could ever accuse it of being a bubble, and I hope it doesn't run the same risk. We're talking about a much, much, much wider geography, first of all, 54 countries, so many different categories and schools and artists who are included in that, and the I would say of all of our regional sales and regional departments at Sotheby's, I know this from talking to my colleagues and looking at the facts. Our sale attracts more international attention than any of those other regional sales. So we don't rely so much on any kind of one economy or one type of buyer.
Thank you. Touria, again, you've obviously cultivated the whole idea of art that's come off the continent. What's been your experience? Has that?
Listen, same debate than Anna. Obviously, people don't like to be categorized, and I think nobody likes to be categorized. And but I think when I started in 2013, it was the option of having a fair presenting artists from the continent, or not having a fair with our artists coming from the continent and them not being present, you know. So the choice was very clear and very simple, you know. So I feel like what we're able to achieve in 154 is having African artists being very proud to be part of 154 and being represented in an African, you know, organization dedicated to them. And I was very happy, for example, to talk to a gallery who participated in October Gallery, because they always bring all their artists at the fair, and I always tell them, can you stream it down, please? Like, bring 2, bring 3, not everyone. And they're like, but you don't understand, they all want to be there. They all want to be at 154, so it will be punishing them to not bring them. And they have that discussion with their artists, so it's very exciting for us to see that they're proud and they don't see it as a negative, you know, anymore. I do feel, you know, with the time, and I always say it, and maybe it's the truth, I'm not lying, that the most beautiful death of 154 is that we don't need it anymore. And I think that, of course, you know, I'm not going to be pushy on trying to do a fair. Well, there's no need for it because all those galleries are included. And I can take that example with the IO. I mean, when you started 154, you were not participating to international art fairs, but now you're included in those international art fairs, which is amazing. So this is, you know, going through that path. It's you know, what we're all aiming for is like that there's an equality, and, you know, there's no more need of a dedicated platform.
But
Sorry.
Please,
I was going to say I have no problem with regionality, it's personally. And it's evolving as well. So the first thing to remember is that you all want to be associated with success. And the only problem that comes with Africa is that it's a continent, not a country. So when you say African art, you're not saying Chinese art or Indian modernism or, you know, Japanese calligraphy. You're saying a whole continent that looks very different. Now, that's what we have to work with at the moment, and that's where we're at. So we're working with it, but physically, nobody remembers where Picasso comes from. So it's not been, you know, put in any particular spot anymore. But it's not a problem. It's actually something we could actually work collectively with across the continent as well. There needs to be a lot more trade done amongst Africans anyway. So if we're being put in this African category, maybe Senegalese people should start buying Nigerian art. And Nigerians should start buying, you know,
But
the
you know,
Gambian.
I've been seeing it more and more, to be honest. There's galleries now representing, you know, for example, the gallery in Ghana in 1957 are now representing artists from North Africa. You have galleries in Casablanca now including, you know, different artists from West Africa. So I think that this is opening also a different market and, you know, giving a taste to different, you know, audience of different artists. So I think, you know, there's more south to south than we imagined, which is amazing. Forget about the biennales, you know, that regroup so many artists from all over the continent, but it's really nice to see that there's this expansion of taste, you know.
And Enam, any comments on that?
I think for me, the issue then becomes this idea of African art and this kind of aesthetic that has basically been set by the Western art canon, and the effects that it has on diasporan artists, so Black British artists, for instance, where they don't necessarily make work that fits that aesthetic, and so they get spaced out because within the Western art canon, it's a case of it's one in, one out sort of thing, where there should be space for everyone and everyone's voice and everyone's different styles. So it becomes almost competitive, which I think is actually combative, and I really do feel like there needs to be work done as well to create space for the Black British artists. Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't want to talk too much about 154, but I mean, we have models about, you know, not since the beginning in 2013, where we always had space for, the African diaspora, and saying diaspora in that word was a really wide definition. We always judge every application on the quality of the application and what, we think could, but, in 154 New York, we have African American artists. In London, we had Black British artists, in the past. Obviously, they need to feel some kind of connection to the platform, but this is also, maybe it's the audience being, also thinking that they will meet a certain kind of art at 154. But I think we have more and more audience that are so international, so coming from the different, art fairs, that they don't have really also that in mind. They really are, appreciating quality. And I think as soon as the artist is at that quality, it doesn't matter, if, but I mean, we can't create every different space either, so it's a question of trying to find one that works for the majority.
Yeah, no, I think, so my point is more the case that, contemporary African art is what's trending at the moment, and I think on a wider scale, there's no space for Black British art. I know that you do a lot with 154, but I think, we've had experiences with press where we had a PR company that was kind of trying to pitch to get some press for us, and they said, "Oh, come back to us when there's more of an African art angle," and you get that so much, and it's just a very skewed and very, very skewed point of view that there can only be one kind of angle.
I remember asking Hassan Hajjaj if he was bothered by the label African artist, and he said, "You know what? Give me as many labels as you can. I'm an African artist. I'm an international artist. I'm a British artist. You can call me a Middle Eastern artist." He's from Morocco and splits his practice between here and Morocco. "I'm a photographer. I'm a pop artist. The more categories you give me, the wider my audience." So that was something that he really embraced. Enam, I totally hear you though, because I do think Black British art is yet to be really appreciated.
So can I just say two things to that? So one thing is we don't need too many people to do anything in the art world. It's not like most other industries. You don't need that many. If it's construction to build a bridge, you need firms, you need surveyors, you need architects, you need construction workers. In the art world, if you take 20 people and you want to make a name for an artist, 20 of you on the audience and decide, okay, we're going to collect this artist, you could drive that name forward very quickly. So that's the first thing about moving the needle. So if you have your collective friends of the diaspora wanting to channel their own collecting activity to those Black British artists, we should start speaking about that. Yeah. You don't need the continent to drive that forward. That's one. Two is, if everybody here just bought a piece and just a small thing about moving the needle forward, and then just find your own artist, buy your own artist, then go to your corporate space tomorrow and say, "Oh, is JP Morgan collecting? Is Ernst & Young collecting?" And they say, "Oh, yes, we are buying." And then you ask them, "Oh, do you buy very many Black artists or very African artists?" You probably find they say, "Oh, not quite." And make them buy it. You can. And that's one way to actually ensure your investments already has value rise the next morning.
I was going to say there's so much you can do as a collector beyond purchase a piece. When you invest in a young artist, you're taking a risk. Maybe that's not going to pay off as an investment, but you can follow their career, you can create a relationship, you can support them in so many ways by talking about them with other collectors, if you have the means. Yeah, absolutely. Corporate collecting is such an important thing. If you are involved with museum boards, you can be an advocate for them there. There are many, many ways for a collector to support an artist beyond writing a check.
And just like Ayo said earlier, even though the African art is a flavor of the month, the prices are relatively accessible. This is a good point, is in terms of buying stock. For example, they say buy low, and if you keep sit on your stock for as long as possible, and do some of the things that they're mentioning, you will have the art validated. Go out there, buy more, advocate for the artists, get them more involved. I think the only thing that will happen is that you see the prices for the very good artists increasing. And I guess when you're buying, yes, you're buying sentimentally, but hopefully, I think many people are also buying, not because most collectors don't want to sell, correct me if I'm wrong, but they like the fact that an artist that they discovered 10 years ago has the price has jumped exponentially, and just feel, wow, that was good taste, not only from not from an aesthetic point of view, But, you know, I look good if I have an artist who I can say, yes, I bought him 10 years ago for X, Y, Z, and now he's at the Tate Modern, and I think for a collector, that's actually the proud moment. And I think Black British, if you allow me to just throw in my own 2 pennies worth, yes, there needs to be different platforms, and not different from African art, but I think if African art seems to be saying you're not letting you in the door, I think you need to sort of create a platform.
Of course, yes.
That's going to, and hopefully that's what you're doing.
That's what we're doing,
And
yes,
maybe if you want to say, before we ask to Q&A, I'd like to hear a bit more about the foundation you've created to promote that.
Yes, so the collective, as it stands, has 4 members. So there's Adelaide Damour, who is a painter and performance artist, Colleen De Souza, who's a street artist, Aisha Faisal, who's a painter, and then obviously myself. And so I think I mentioned a little bit before, part of our model is to help each other build sustainable careers. So that's looking at ways that we can kind of create revenue for our work. So, and that's for the collective, but also individually. And so for us, the collective is a legacy project. So it's about creating an incubator program to help artists coming up. And that's in terms of art business, learning more about what it is to be an artist, how to market yourself, but also thinking outside of the box in terms of ways that you can build revenue. So looking at commercial partners, maybe getting licensing your artwork to, you know, a brand. So not necessarily thinking that it's just about selling your art to collectors or trying to get your art into institutions. And it's also, like I said before, about opening up the conversation on a global scale. So in 2017, we did a cross-cultural exchange in Ghana, and that was working with 3 other female artists and just getting to learn and understand the challenges they face in that region, because it's more a patriarchal system. So that's the issues that they kind of tend to face. And so we came together collaboratively to deliver an exhibition for Chaliwate Festival, which is a street art festival, absolutely amazing. If you want to go, please do, in August every year. And it really is one of the amazing projects in Ghana that is putting Ghanaian art on the map. And we did an artist talk as well, and just talking about women's art in Ghana, and is there space for it, or is there such a thing as women's art? So we want to replicate that across the board, and then be able to do things like exchanges where we bring artists over to the UK and do collaborative projects here and travel globally as well.
Great, thank you. Well, good luck with that.
Thank you.
Good luck with that. I think it's probably a good time to throw the floor open to the Q&A. Someone got the mic? Oh, Mr. Shonibara, please.
Sorry, what's your name?
Enam.
Anna, yeah. See, I think the important thing, you know, I'm just sort of raising this, and also the auction house and the galleries, I mean, I think they can help, because I think that critical acclaim is very important for an artist, so institutional validation. And I also know that a lot of curators go to art fairs. I actually think, you know, the validation by the institutions, it's far, far more important than the commercial, you know, the writers, because basically you start with, you know, this is why I do a project space, and I've done it for about 11 years, because I want those artists to be written about. I want them to have shows and be written about. The commercial galleries, you know, after the kind of serious critical writing about the work, then the commercial galleries pay attention and they pick it up. And the curators pay attention then. But I think it's very hard to, you know, one can do private initiatives, you know, like project spaces and so on. But if the work is not critically validated, honestly, I mean, as an artist myself, I'd rather have critical acclaim than financial success, because that's the long term. You know, a collector will buy your work, they can put it in storage, it doesn't mean much, you know. And so, I mean, I think the galleries, that's something that I think is, you know, it's actually very important. So I think, you know, that's something, you know, I've done my own little way to try to support artists in that, you know, in my own little way, but I think for the galleries as well. Because, you know, in my experience, my galleries, I mean, they really push for me to get museum shows. They push for curators to see the work, you know, and I'd rather that than getting the pounds, because it's not long, that's not long term. So I'm just wondering, what you guys are doing, to kind of, well, Ayo, what are you doing to push your, to push curators to see your artists, and museums, to support them?
This is an easy one for me, actually. Enam and I actually work very closely together. I showed all of the BBFA just last year for a show. I'm taking them to Artex Lagos this year, right, for a show. And this is all for a collective that is actually not known on the continent. So there is a gamble on our side as well. But to answer your question, so that was an easy one, actually. Yeah. To answer your question directly, Yinka, is...
Not the collector
Not
part.
the collectors, yes.
No.
To answer the questions directly, the institutions, we try. We always do. There's a mailing list. We engage with them personally. We call them all the time. What we're finding, even with all this excitement about African art, right? I showed Gbewonyo, MBE, someone you know very well, Old Master. The Queen of England sat for him as far back as 1957. I showed him in New York at the Armory, lined up as many curators as I could, right, to say, okay, this is Gbewonyo, this is what's going on. I'm not exaggerating. 80% of them had no idea who he was, right? Before I start to talk about Enam, I'm saying, okay, this is our master, already pre-validated. There is so much to learn in the African art space, especially by those institutions.
I think we should mention a couple of key curators, though, at this point, Touria and I were just talking about before we came out here, in that there are certain curators who can, beyond the market, they can make the market, and I certainly pay attention to certain institutions and certain curators and who they're looking at. But people like Okwe and Wezor and BC Silva, who both passed away this year, did huge, did so much for the continent and artists for the continent. And their legacy is living on in the market space as well. And there are the next generation of curators behind them who I think everyone on this panel tries to engage with as much as possible.
Sorry, I was going to say, and that's 30 years work that BC and Oku were talking about. So it's not like we've stopped. Don't get me wrong. I'm not going to close down the gallery because the institution's not paying attention, but there's just so much to do. We're trying, we're doing it, but it's just a slow, long game. Yeah. And we're not going to stop doing it.
And I guess, I'll give the mic in a minute, but what I was really trying to do is to make the link between, critical acclaim and sales. There's a link. But you start from the critical acclaim, and then the sales can come later.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's it.
Another question? Oh, you.
Inka, I totally agree with you, but I think coming from more the commercial viewpoint about this world, we've just been to Venice early May, and even Venice is art market driven. And I think in order for any non-American, non-English market to succeed, you need to combine the critical acclaim with the art market in order for these people like yourselves to be bought by Tate, and, drawing from the comparison between Chinese markets and the Indian market pre and post crash of 2008, the Indian market really sustained itself because it mainly was purchased by NRI, the non-residential Indians. So I'd like to challenge the dichotomy that was presented here with either it's supported by local African collectors or by international collectors. I think maybe the solution is for the local wealth to buy locally in Africa, and yes, they'll get the discount, that's how it is. It's the same in the Middle East. But for Africans who are high net worth living outside of Africa to purchase from people like Ayu, Stephen Friedman, and from Sotheby's. And then usually what happens, then an international art market takes place. And then eventually it will end up at Tate, Macal, Guggenheim, etc. I think it needs to be like a strategic viewpoint and a collaboration, which is already happening. It just needs to be organically, but the money here outside of Africa needs to buy here African art.
You make a good point, especially about the Venice Biennale as well, which is the biggest art show in the world. And I think everyone there's, it's no great secret that actually, like you say, it's really a trading place, a marketplace. Basel will open next week, and all the artists who were shown at Venice will be available for purchase at Basel. Africa is vastly underrepresented at Venice. I think the best showing has ever been 8 national pavilions, and some of us have all taken part in a forum that takes place there called the African Art in Venice Forum, which addresses that very issue. But actually I chaired a talk there which was throwing that problem on its head. Putting a national pavilion on at Venice is hugely, hugely expensive. Is that really the best use of particularly government or public spending? And if that decision is taken, how do you then bring that economy back to the continent and back to the country? The fact is that of the 8 countries that do have national pavilions, only one of them really has galleries that then take those artists to the international market, which is South Africa with Stevenson and Goodman, who do participate in those big, big, big art fairs. And the others like Zimbabwe and Madagascar and the Seychelles, I'm trying to think who else was there, Ghana, Nigeria 2 years ago. Very few of them are, it's wonderful that they're there and great for those artists to be part of such an intellectually respected institution, but that is not translating then into the marketplace if they're not with one of those big galleries.
Any questions?
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. It was fantastic. My name is Mariam Lawal, and I've actually recently set up a platform to represent artists from Africa and the diaspora. So obviously I loved everything that you spoke about. But one of the main issues which people have sort of pointed out to me as I was getting things going is, is this point which you've mentioned as well, about it being a passing fad and it's hot, it's trending right now. And how do you, as commercial players in this market, what do you think about that? Is it true? Do you think that, yes, it is just a fad? And if so, how do we sustain it? How do we make sure that people don't just move to the next hot thing and, forget the fact that these are people's livelihoods that are at stake?
Can we take maybe 2 questions at a time, and then, because I think to get more people involved, maybe Bibi wants to ask a question, and then we will answer on the next 2. Thank you.
For those of us in the audience who haven't quite reached Patek Philippe levels yet, and perhaps don't know, who are some of the young up-and-coming artists who you're all particularly excited about, and why?
Ayo, you start with
You know what I'm going to do. I'm just going to name drop my artist and then tell you to come and see me. That's a basic truth in answer. But yeah, let's talk about that straight after. And there are tons of them. There are lots and lots of artists out there. I am particularly proud of some of the people I've put out there. There is a lot happening in places like Ghana, where they're punching well above their weight for a country so small. Benin as well. And so artistically that is. There's a lot of names you can you mention. Answering the fad question, it's not a fad. It's not at all. The press is writing up as a fad, but the first gallery in Nigeria was in 1934. The first art school, the Khartoum school, was pre-independence. There's always been art traded. I actually have an artist, a collector that came to me and wanted to sell a piece that his dad bought in the late 80s. And his dad bought it for $50,000. Now that's significant money back then. There's the continent itself is present, is real, it will always be there. The artistic production is since the 14th century, right? It didn't pick up now. It's long line of classical African art to modernism to contemporary. You have to remember people like Ella Natsui, master of contemporary now, is spoken about like a discovery. It's been making art for 60 years, So forget the whole press fad thing. It's here to stay. It's not going to go anywhere. It might change. You might get less press in 5 years when they move on to, I think, Aboriginal art is what's been spoken about now. No, it's true. But don't worry, your business will survive.
If I can add, I think what's even happening now is that maybe African art is moving into the sort of, I would say, the Western structures of art fairs and being present in international auctions, because a lot of African art has always traded hands on the continent in an informal way. And so seeing these structures is what will make it more sustainable and actually what is going to drive the value up because now that we're actually coming into the global stage. Another question? Oh, Bibi. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I've got 2 points I want to make. One is about language, the language we've been using on the panel around global and international. And there's an assumption that Africa is outside of the global, the way you guys have been talking. And I think we need to be very mindful of the way in which we use language. That's one. And two is to the point Yinka made about critical acclaim. And I think maybe the word is about the discourse around African art. We need, in order for the value to be raised, we need more writing about it. We need more critical engagement. Is by having more writing and text of engagement with the visuals and the art world. This is how we're going to raise the value. We can't escape the intellectual and academic intervention in any kind of art. So for example, I'm in publishing. You can have successful authors today, financially successful. They're not going to live into the archive or into history without academic engagement of this work. It is those people who have been writing about who are going to go into the canon. And it's by going into the canon that those values will be raised. Thank you.
And to agree with the first one, but also, again, to pick up a second piece of language, and that was the language that we've been using of value. And I think you've probably said what I was thinking, in the sense that the value isn't only commercial, but the other value is the value that is appreciating. And I was going to ask you in particular what the other types of value or manifestations of value might be to artists, which will then get them written about, appreciated, and then subsequently get the commercial value. And I think also it was the critical acclaim. So in fact, I wasn't going to ask the question because I felt it was sort of answered by Yinka Shodimbare from that point of view. But I just wondered, maybe as a young artist, what ways, or everybody on the panel, how can you then value artists in a way that isn't necessarily meaning that they're getting hundreds and thousands of dollars in America, so that you don't feel undervalued? There must be there have to be other ways that you can feel valued, and that will then and I probably sound completely illiterate, but it's late in the day.
Yeah, no, I think it basically starts with representation. So my arts education was here in the UK, and I didn't see any people that looked like me in the textbooks. I didn't see any people that looked like me, majority, in the institutions that we visited, the exhibitions that we were taken to. And it wasn't until my university education that I was even taught about Anish Kapoor and Yinka Shodimbare. And then it wasn't until I was setting up the collective that I started learning about all these amazing female artists that were working in the UK in the 80s. So I think it starts from the education space, first of all, and then that will translate, because for a young black girl whose family, you know, have worked so hard to move to the UK, and she wants to be an artist, and the first thing they say is, well, how are you going to make any money? Because they don't see any artists that look like them making money, and so they don't see it as a viable industry for, you know, their child to prosper. And I think there's an issue around that in terms of within our own communities and the value that we place on art, and that's a historical thing, because our art has always been termed with, you know, terms such as primitive and tribal that, you know, leave a bad taste in your mouth. So within our community, we need to change that mindset and really start valuing our own artists first. And that does start from education space, seeing that representation and it being positive representations in art spaces. And then that will translate to us feeling valued, but then also having more platforms for us to actually exhibit our work, for people to actually see it, to start to understand the work that we make and what it is that we're trying to say.
If I can just say something to the words international and global. I think, I mean, everybody else might have a different take on it, but I think what we should realize, and let's be realistic, and the theme is investing in African art. African art has been traded on the continent, and it's only recently that international buyers and collectors and institutions have had access. And that's why you start saying African art is going global. African art is now being validated by the Tate, by the MoMA. You go to international art fairs, and even if it's a sprinkling, there is some recognition. Now, until that happens and continues to happen in a bigger way, until African art becomes internationalized, there's no apology for that. It has to become internationalized. It has to become global. The value, and not just the commercial value, but the validation of what we do as African artists, or the recognition of the practice, if it stays only on the continent, then it's a market that should stay on the continent. And we shouldn't be sitting here to invest in it. But if we're asking and wanting the world to recognize, unfortunately for us as Africans, I think it's a shame that we don't have any institutions on the continent that actually can do the validation. We don't have platforms. We have to rely on the...
Listening to myself speak sometimes, there is a Western bias. I've been there for a while, and I'm speaking with a Western bias because I'm living in the West. So, you know, looking at ourselves as the other, even though I go to Lagos more than most other people that actually I'm speaking to, it's not an unusual situation. So, yeah, we might have to stand corrected on that. We need to validate our own art. That's the simple truth. We need to, if we don't want to build the museums, we need to find another way to validate it. We need our own writers writing about our own art. I asked you, I was going as far as to say, we need our own writers writing about our own art in local languages that nobody else speaks. So they have to ask you to translate so that they can understand where you're coming from. There's no way around that. That's the critical, and that's the heritage factor that is important. Yes, so Yinka is right, and that's the pushback I was giving, because if I'm calling the museums in the West, MoMA, Switzerland, Norway, wherever it is, you know, and say, oh, you have to look at these artists, of course, but they've also got a lot of other international artists to look at. If I had 3 museums in Lagos of the quality of, say, you know, international standards, I promise you my artists will be in all those museums. Because I'll be calling someone that I probably spoke to 5 weeks ago, I went to school with, I went to uni with. It's the way the world works. So we need our own validation. I'm not saying we need our own museums, period. I'm saying we need our own validation, whatever that validation model takes. And we have to start working at it very quickly. Writing is a very important one, because anybody can write. And if you know what you're writing about, you can write it well. No, I mean anybody with critical thinking analysis. Stop being difficult, you know what I mean.
Any other questions, please?
Hi, my name is Diane Audrey. Last week I organized a Douala Art Fair with the idea to create a new generation of African buyer. I have 3 questions, because a lot of artists
we're going to ask you to ask one, I'm sorry, because time is running out and we've got 2 or 3 other hands here.
Because there's a problem with the price. Because, and I was talking about Sotheby's or even Piazza, sometimes as an African collector, you always buy maybe a painting for 1,000 euro, and one day Piazza decide to sell the same painting at 31,000 euro. So how, and now the artists say, now my price is going to be 31,000 euro. So I'm always like, what should we do? Because we spent 3 years, 4 years buying art at 1,000, and now you just decide, because of this auction, that your price is going to be 30,000. How today an African artist can manage to define the right price for them?
Can I answer that? I know I'm not in the auction, but I'm sorry, it's education. An auction house is not a gallery and it's not a fair. So if they don't get that this is not the value of the art, but the value that they're acquiring in the secondary market, there's nothing to do. This is like primary education on the art industry. They should know that this price is a price they have at auction house as a secondary market, but this is not the value that the gallery or they should sell to their clients.
Hannah wants to say something. Come on, it's Hannah's question.
I wanted to ask, are you asking as an artist or as a collector?
As a collector, because many, I mean, in Cameroon today we have a lot of issue with that.
Yeah.
Because you have artists, like young artists, who just start working maybe 5 years ago, that sold at this price, compared to older artists. So there's a lot of fights.
Right. So I would say in the first instance, you should feel very satisfied that you supported that artist at that price point and that their prices have moved on. And I would say, I think I was going to jump in and talk about the primary market, but every artist, should seek to have a good relationship with a dealer who's going to, have a trajectory for them in their career, and their prices should be advancing over the years as they do more and gain a better reputation. The thing about the auctions is that we place a reserve or an estimate on a piece, but we are then pitching it out to the world and saying, come and fight over this. So if an artist is hot, is in the right collections, is priced properly, and is kind of all the things that we've been talking today, and been doing the right residencies, and is coming to the attention of the right writers, then lots of people are going to be interested and push the price up. And then that often does have a knock-on effect to the primary market. Then a lot of people do say, okay, maybe we should be looking at repricing these pieces, or you'll find that all the people who weren't successful at auction will then go to the dealer and say, do you have any more by this artist? Equally, it can go wrong, and pieces can sell for below retail prices, and that happens a lot in the secondary market. Less so, well, I won't say less so in the African space, but that is the bigger reason people have problems with the secondary market, is when they don't meet the retail prices. And more often than not, if an artist is with a good gallery, they can still maintain their retail prices even when there's been a less satisfactory price at auction. So that's the kind of difference between the two markets.
This is a question that I have. I'm really interested in this. Is it just an African, obviously, section in an auction house that is allowed to basically buy straight from the artist?
Okay, so that's the difference between us and all the other auction houses.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Right, so we don't accept consignments from the artists.
Okay, but
whereas I know other auction houses who hold African art auctions do.
Because that's, I think, where the problem is,
Yeah.
is that the artist has the option to give straight for Piazza, for example.
So I try to operate my department as any department at Sotheby's would do. Yeah. We're strictly on the secondary market. Occasionally we might work with the trade, but mostly we're working with private collectors who are deaccessioning for whatever reason, and we don't accept consignments directly from the artist, unless there's a circumstance like it's a charity auction and they've decided to donate something to a good cause. And I do think that does cause problems in the secondary market.
The gentleman at the back has been putting his hand up.
Hi. It seems to me, from hearing how you and Nick are talking, when talking about investing in art, we are actually talking about investing in the infrastructure that will validate this art in the African context. Now, here I am, I'm an investor. An investment is not an investment until it's time-bound. So if I'm going to invest in this infrastructure, be it a pavilion in Venice Biennale or buying a publication such as Contemporary Hand, I want to know how long until I recover my investment. So if I'm investing in this infrastructure, you got to give me a time. Is it 1 decade, 2 decades? What's the number?
There's a cautionary tale about investing in arts I like to give, and I always throw it back to my aunties in Nigeria that buy gold, and they'll tell you it's an investment. And they'll buy this nice jewelry that could be melted, and the uncles will go, but you spend a lot of money. Like, no, this is investment value. It has a lot of investment value. They never sell this jewelry. Never do. They'll pass it on to their daughters at the day of the wedding and say the investment has passed hand. Now, if anything happens, they're not going to really liquidate their assets. Art is very similar to that in that respect. You're buying your heritage if you're buying African art. If you're a Chinese collector, you're buying Zawuki, you're buying into Chinese culture and heritage, long-standing, right? You take pleasure in seeing the value rise. If you're smart, you buy 3 from each artist, so one day you could liquidate one at some auction house and take some money back. In fact, take a lot of money back in many instances, right? But if you go straight in saying, I want to buy art, right? And I want to liquidate in X amount of years, is not that kind of asset class. This is why UBS, who is the biggest sponsor of Art Basel, which is the biggest art fair in the world, do not actually have art as an asset class on their books. That tells you something. It's ethical investing, is, emotional investing, it's all sorts of, I'm still using the word investing because you can still buy, the Corpus Christi, the Christ piece, that was bought for £5,000 and sold for $450 million. That's a lot of money, a lot of return. But I'm sure the guy that bought it originally wasn't thinking, how many years do I have to wait?
Can I add something else, another perspective to that? And this is as someone who advises, in the sort of wealth management space. I have to be honest with you that African art has not yet become an investable asset class, but art is. Let's face it. I mean, people, last week or the other week, Jeff Koons has become the most expensive artist at 900 million. And there are collectors who bought that piece, who have traded that piece 3 or 4 times. The first Picasso was traded, the most famous one, I forgot the name now, but at something like $47,000, people who bought it. And within 25 years, that piece was worth hundreds of millions. Now, art is an investable asset class. One day, some of that African art that's hanging on our walls will have actually achieved the sort of, capital appreciation. And that's what I think some people who speculate are hoping. Now, what's going to drive the market is the galleries, is the auction houses, because you need a benchmark. You need to know that, that Emomo or that Enatsui, which you bought 20 years ago or 10 years ago, is now worth X because it's also in the Tate, it's also in MoMA, curators are writing about it, and there's a validation, and the price will increase. There is no timeline on that speculation. So while you buy it, enjoy it. That's what Ayo is saying. Enjoy it and be proud that actually you're holding a piece of your legacy. Enjoy it and be proud that what you're doing is actually helping to ensure that in some cases African art hopefully will stay on the continent, and we won't be having this debate in 50 years that we're having about classical pieces being in other museums. And that's why I always say to Africans who have some money, after you bought that watch, how many can you wear?